Well, this is Breakthrough News, and you are watching The Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts here, Eugene here alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Kalik. Rania, great to be back alongside you.
Always good to be alongside you, Eugene.
Yes, well, of course, it's always our pleasure to be here with everyone. And as we start out the show, there's quite a bit going on around the world, as there always is. And we'll have quite a bit to talk to you about here today. But of course, the breaking news here today is Mr. Sinwar, the head of Hamas, has allegedly been killed by Israeli forces in Gaza. Hamas has, in fact, not commented as of yet, but there are widespread reports from Israel all across the mainstream and the Western media that he was killed, that a DNA test was conducted in order to confirm his body. There are pictures that are circulating on the internet that I think many people are saying appear to be him, but again, no comment from Hamas. But nonetheless, a major moment and a major inflection point here, Rania, in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Well over 40,000 Palestinians, I believe, now have been killed, close to well over 100,000 have been injured, and now we have another major assassination. I mean, I know we're going to talk more about it here, Rania, at the end of the show, so stick around to hear me and Rania get into this more. But if there's anything you want to just say off the top, Rania, I did want to give you the opportunity, given that this is a breaking news scenario.
Well, I just want to refrain from actually using the word assassination here, because it seems as though, from what the Israelis are saying, if this was in fact Yahya Sinwar, and I will say more about this later in the show, but he was apparently killed in a firefight above ground in a house against Israeli soldiers he was with two other fighters. And when the Israeli soldiers saw who they had just killed, they noticed he kind of looked like Yahya Sinwar. This is from the Israeli side of things. And so that's why they took his body in for DNA testing. So I think it suggests a couple of things. One, it wasn't like some Israeli intelligence that found his location. Two, we've been told for months that this man is underground, deep in a tunnel, surrounding himself with hostages as human shields. When actually if this was in fact him, was just fighting on the front lines like all the other Palestinians in the Qassam brigades. I think which says a lot about what we've been told. And moreover, and I'll say more about this as well, Yahya Sinwar is somebody who expected to die. I don't think he was expecting to grow old in some, retiring, being able to play with his grandkids, because he's a resistance fighter. He's a resistance leader. And they're just, the Israelis are taking a victory lap, but killing this one individual, while it matters, does not mean they've defeated Hamas. And we've seen repeatedly that when they kill leaders, whether it's Ismail Haniyeh, whether it's Hassan Nasrallah, whether it's Fuad Shukr, whether it's Mohammed Deif, whoever it might be, it doesn't change the fact that the organization is still fighting on the ground and the military situation remains the same. So anyways, we'll say more about it later on in the show, but just some points I wanted to raise before we move on for now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think those are good points and important points and more to say. So stick around through the fantastic guests that we have here for you all throughout the show, because we'll have more to say about this alleged killing. And I say alleged because Hamas has not confirmed it, of the head of Hamas in Gaza during the ongoing genocide. So, we're going to get ready to get right into it. Of course, if you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe, hit the bell so you get the alerts for the things that you subscribe to, including dispatches from Rania Kalik. A lot of great stuff coming up there. And we'll make some other announcements here, I guess, Rania, as we go throughout the show, unless there's anything you want to mention right off the top.
Yeah, I'm not going to let you move on before I tell people to smash that like button, you guys.
I should have just pushed
like button. Music to my ears. It helps boost us in the algorithm. So make sure you smash that like button. Make sure you're subscribed to Breakthrough News. And if you want to help support the show and all our other excellent content at Breakthrough News, go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Become a member for as little as $5 a month, though there's no limit to how much you can donate. You can feel free to donate $1 billion a month. And you can also access exclusive content, exclusive merch. And that's my spiel. We can move on, Eugene. I'll allow it.
Okay, well, listen, if you allow it, then we can definitely do it. We want to move forward here to Pakistan, where some people have undoubtedly seen the internal situation there continues to be very hot. A number of issues around former Prime Minister Imran Khan, but also Pakistan has been the site of some of the largest solidarity protests with Palestine. What I think looked to me like the biggest demonstration I saw, rising in anger at the killing of Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon. So to get into all of this, Pakistan, Lebanon, Imran Khan. We are very, very honored to be joined once again by good friend Junaid Ahmed, who's a professor of law, religion, global politics, and the director for the Center for the Study of Islam and Decolonization in Islamabad. Junaid, as always, thanks for being with us.
Eugene and Rania, always a pleasure to be with you guys.
Well, great to have you here, and I really want to start with this question that's been on my mind for several weeks now. After the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, I mean, I could be wrong about this. I wasn't looking everywhere, but it seemed Pakistan was actually the country that had some of the largest protest and anger at his killing and people coming out in solidarity with him. Give us some context around that, because I don't think people normally associate Pakistan and Lebanon too much.
No, they don't, and probably for good reason. The Pakistani population historically has been removed from the what you can call the larger anti-colonial third worldist movement, at one stage known as the non-aligned movement. You and your audience will know that our next door neighbor, India, played a huge role in that, and India has had those types of movements within it that have been a part of this global anti-colonial movement. So Pakistan, since the Cold War, the Pakistani ruling elite made a decision to firmly be in the camp of Washington. However, what has happened, and we've discussed this many times before, since the ouster of the very popular former Prime Minister Imran Khan in April of 2022, what you have had now of people getting out in the streets in defense of Khan, but more so what they at least perceive what he represented. That was a much more independent, sovereign Pakistan, not subservient to outside powers, especially to Washington, and some elements of social justice. Now, many of us have been saying that, well, this is actually part of a movement that is addressing the issue of incomplete decolonization, betrayed decolonization. And so, as this political consciousness has emerged very rapidly over the past 2 years, we have seen Pakistanis educate themselves much more about global struggles, particularly as the region of West Asia or the Middle East explodes and their axis of resistance. And so people knew who Nasrallah was. They knew who Ismail Hania was. And so, but Nasrallah, as you all know, is this larger than life character. And it's really interesting because there has been an incredible and a horrible dose of Wahhabi, Sunni fundamentalist extremism that was infused in Pakistan since the late 1970s and early 80s as part of the United States Saudi jihad in Afghanistan against the commies. So the other thing we have to understand and appreciate is that this is a country in which sectarianism was driven in all parts of society, not just in the religious schools, the very intimidating madrasas, but everywhere. And so the fact that the majority of the Pakistanis are Sunni, they're not Shia, but the fact that Hassan Nasrallah has become the most popular leader, in addition to their own Imran Khan, says a lot, actually. The transcending of these sectarian divisions, which were fueled from the outside. So this is kind of part of the kind of inspiring part of this whole process, that finally Pakistanis are making these connections with resistance movements, particularly in the Middle East. But the interesting thing is, by studying Hezbollah and Hamas and the leadership, the strategic intelligence of a man like Nasrallah, Pakistanis have also learned a lot about other struggles in the global south that they knew nothing about in the past, particularly, say, struggles in Latin America. So this has been the situation which, of course, the national security state in Pakistan has been trying to repress through the most draconian measures. But its legitimacy is crumbling right in front of our eyes, no matter how much Washington is trying to salvage it.
Imran, I want to go back to something else we've had you on to talk about before, and that is the U.S. participation that we later learned about in the overthrow of Imran Khan. How might things have been different in Pakistan with regard to the government, not the people, during this current escalating genocide, had Imran Khan still been in power?
Right. Rania, this is what has been kind of on the tip of the tongue of everyone, what they've been thinking about throughout this entire genocide since last October. Pakistanis, both within Pakistan and Pakistanis abroad, who also, revere Imran Khan and are very much kind of against the current regime in Pakistan. So everyone remembers him in this moment. I mean, generally they remember, but particularly in this moment, because he was so incredibly vocal on Palestine. And whenever he would speak about the other issue, which he was very passionate about, which was Kashmir, both of them would be in the same sentence: the Kashmiri movement for self-determination and the Palestinian one. And his kind of Twitter account, Twitter, which has been of course banned in Pakistan, but throughout this, Khan has whatever way he could, whatever mechanism he had, conveyed this solidarity that a genocide is being taken place, that the West and the United States in particular is responsible for it. So we all, on the one hand, we're like, well, if only he was in power, maybe the Pakistani military would do what the Pakistani people want. And that has been to physically go to Palestine as a protection force. Again, Rania and your viewers will know that we're not talking about a small country here. Fifth, sixth largest country in the world, fifth, sixth largest military, nuclear armed, and completely good for nothing other than repressing its own population. But the desire of the Pakistanis throughout this period has been that why won't we just go there as a protection force for Gaza? And so we think about what Khan may have done. Of course, that may have also been wishful thinking, because there were so many issues, including this one, for which the regime change against him took place. So, I mean, we like kind of imagine that he would do something, but of course it's often not so simple.
And what is the status now of Mr. Khan's case? I mean, we've seen a lot of ongoing protests. I mean, I know the last big wave of protests, they tried to, block off whole cities, and they still failed to keep people from coming out in what at least seemed to me to be relatively large numbers. But it does seem like there's a thicket of sort of lawfare going on here. Where do things stand in terms of his imprisonment and what could happen in the near future?
Right. So he is still in his, what you can call, a supermax prison, isolated from everyone. In fact, at some points, they did allow some family to visit. Now, that family, particularly his sisters, they've been imprisoned as well. This has been an kind of incredible period in Pakistan's history, because you have had some of the worst, as I've pointed out before on your show, worst forms of state violence and terror brought upon the Pakistani population since the removal of Khan in April 2022. But, perhaps at least one of the first times this has happened is that when a civilian prime minister has been removed, massive demonstrations have taken place, because, as I've mentioned here before, usually when these prime ministers are removed, no one is really out in the streets trying to defend them, because they've been, corrupt, haven't done anything for the people, have been indistinguishable from military rule. Now, for Khan, they have been on the streets since then, and it's quite miraculous that despite that repression, in the elections in February of this year, in which everything was rigged against the movement of justice, Khan's political party, yet they still won the most seats. And so, when you talk about these assassinations, I heard Rania earlier saying that, we shouldn't even use this term. But one of the reasons I think why Pakistanis are identifying with these Ismail Hania or Nasrallah is because Khan himself has survived 2 assassination attempts before they said that we have no other choice, we're putting him in jail. But the moment right now has been important and significant, because you've seen a fusion of both the internal movement against the civilian military regime with widespread anger and disgust at what is going on in Palestine and now Lebanon, and extending throughout the region. In fact, so much so that when the Iranians retaliated on October 1st, massive demonstrations in support. And again, this transcending of the Shia-Sunni thing is amazing. I think that we have to understand that the Saudis, first, after the Islamic Revolution in 79, where the fear, because fundamentally, whatever else you may think about the ideology, it was an anti-monarchical movement that overthrew the Shah of Iran. And that scared the hell out of the other Gulf monarchs. So they couldn't defeat the movement politically, so they infused it with religious sectarian ideology. The same thing happened in 2006 when Hezbollah wiped the floor with the Israelis in Lebanon. That again, this Shia leader Nasrallah became the most popular leader. And again, the Saudis couldn't tolerate that, but it's no longer working. And the Pakistanis, just it's amazing. I'm talking to friends who, in the past, in like the 70s, would have a lot of them named their kids Yasser after Yasser Arafat. Now they're like, we want to name them Hassan, we want to name them Nasrallah. So this is the feeling here in Pakistan.
Mm.
I think that's a really, really interesting observation. And I want to even broaden it out a bit to ask, and I'm going to bring it to Lebanon for a moment because that's where I live. And I've noticed that, amidst the horrors that Israel has unleashed with the full backing of the US against Lebanon after a year of genocide in Gaza, there's among a kind of maybe bourgeoisie, middle class, upper middle class, a change in views on how they see the US. I'm not saying they're jumping into the resistance camp or they love Iran or even love Hezbollah, but they certainly are people who were, a year ago before all this started, wanted Lebanon to be in the US camp or be more like the US or saw the US as almost a little bit even benevolent. And those attitudes among this particular class of people that I do think that the U.S. is quite dependent on when it comes to like cultural hegemony and sort of gatekeepers in the global South has shifted quite, I think, dramatically in Lebanon. And I'm curious if you've witnessed a similar shift in Pakistan, where I'm sure you have very similar people to who I'm talking about, the ones who are of the elite, or even just, sometimes in the global South, being middle class kind of makes you, a comfortable elite in a way. Those people who maybe do or did have a benevolent view of the U.S., do you see that shifting because of what's happened over the last year?
Unquestionably, Rania, and I think you know that I've spoken about this class in the past in Pakistan. Liberals
Yeah.
who have been part of the intelligentsia, the entire NGOs. Where that whole kind of NGO colonization of this country that many of us complained about, particularly its peak of complete domination, which was the 1990s. The good thing is, where are they now? And that's fine. It's good. We don't need them. And the people's movements actually don't need them, but they're utterly absent. So I think what's happened, Rania, is maybe similar to other countries, that these folks have been put on the defensive. They cannot. They have to really keep their mouths shut at this point. Now, I can't. Some of them may be genuinely appreciating the fact that they may have been wrong, that their perception of the United States as this great champion of democracy, freedom, human rights, or they may have gotten it wrong. But I think most of them probably knew the reality, but their entire existence, their entire careers were built on portraying their own societies as backward, as so on, which of course, during the War on Terror years, I've often pointed it out, legitimated both the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan, saving women in Afghanistan, and many of these tragically supported Pakistani military operations in the Northwest, which as this was the big thing that, as you guys know, Khan was well known for, right? The idea that the war in Afghanistan and the Pakistani participation is immoral, will have a huge human toll, but also will be counterproductive, will be fueling militancy, and that's exactly what happened. So I think what the Israeli support, the U.S. support for this genocide has made those folks realize, or at least keep quiet at this particular point. That's so visible, and that's such a welcome development that they really are not getting in the way of people who are calling the United States out, who are calling the Pakistani government out in its complicity. Whether it's in what's going on in Gaza. I say this because this is a government that is incredibly reluctant to to anger its Zionist patron masters and so on. But the funny thing is, right now, you guys may know we're talking about this. There's an SCO summit going on here in Pakistan, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. But it is so embarrassing and hilarious. So their close ally, China, is dictating to Pakistan at this summit that you guys can't keep your house in order. Our Chinese workers and engineers are being targeted. And so Pakistan, in some ways, it's like a basket case. It goes to the United States, doesn't get enough to feed its oligarchs there, then goes to Beijing. And so I think that this is the scenario in which the Pakistani people are so fed up. And it's great that at this particular moment that liberal intelligentsia that it historically has been so aligned with Washington and pushed that type of agenda, depoliticized the population and said that NGOs will be the savior of everything. They're on the defensive, and thankfully they're not standing as an impediment to this newfound kind of revolutionary almost fervor in the population.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are always happy to have you here to help us sort through it all. Junaid Ahmed, thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Always a pleasure to be with you too. Take care.
Thanks so much. Rania?
Well, Eugene, I mean, that's a really interesting and important developments taking place. And I don't think it's limited to just Pakistan or Lebanon. I think that, in the grand scheme of things, the view of the U.S., was already not the greatest in the global South.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that those who kind of kept those nice views of it, it's shifted quite dramatically for much of the world. Not even just the global South. I mean, probably even in the US, a lot of people's images of their own country has changed in the past year.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Well, we're going to move on to the deepening U.S. complicity in the ongoing genocide in Gaza. Maybe I should say direct participation. The U.S. boots on the ground, the THAAD missile system being sent there to Israel. We are very honored to be joined here on the show to discuss all this and its implications by Mike Prysner, who's an Iraq war veteran, also the host of the Eyes Left podcast and producer for the fantastic Empire Files. Mike, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Happy to be back.
So I guess I just want to start here with maybe the implications of this. I mean, I almost feel like the THAAD deployment to Israel is kind of going a little bit under the radar. People are kind of underplaying it. Like they're not really looking at it as U.S. boots on the ground. Like it's just kind of like, oh, we sent them these missiles. So maybe you could just give us some context for what this really means for the U.S. to be sending these anti-aircraft batteries there to Israel.
Yeah, well, I think the reason that's happening, that it's kind of flying under the radar, is because the presentation of this is just a defensive weapon. This is just to protect Israeli citizens from missiles raining down on their cities. And this isn't a weapon system that is targeting human beings or infrastructure. It shoots missiles out of the sky. So it's presented as just a measure to strengthen a safety and security for the Israeli people. I think that, of course, is a complete lie. This deployment is to prepare for an attack. A U.S.-Israeli attack on Iran. That's why they're anticipating missiles coming back in the other direction, because they are going to hit Iran. It appears so. There is, preceding this deployment, the head of United States Central Command and other U.S. generals have been going to Israel to help Israel prepare for an attack on Iran, which is, not really a retaliation, because the Iranian attack on Israel weeks ago was their kind of long overdue retaliation for several outrageous attacks by the Israeli state that, of course, Iran was under a lot of pressure and really necessity to respond to as a form of deterrent so that there are not continued attacks on Iranian soil. And so the framing of this as defensive, when it really is an offensive thing, is really the way to look at it. I think more importantly is, I would, if I was a U.S. soldier going on this deployment, I'd be a little worried, because in many ways, they're kind of being used as human shields here. The THAAD missile system itself is not really going to offer a lot of military help to the Israeli war machine. I mean, this is a system that hasn't really been used much. It's just one of those things that the military industrial complex makes a ton of money off of. Billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars go into this weapon system, since the 90s. That's really been used like once and didn't even really work that well. And, designed for like 90s era, like Scud missiles. And so Iran, knowing that there's THAAD missile systems there, this is a really easy thing to kind of get around if you're trying to land hits on Israeli targets. What's not as easy to get around is hitting U.S. service members. And so there's been a lot of secrecy about where these THAAD missile systems are being deployed. There's a lot of movement of them around Israel. And so the main purpose of it, there's kind of twofold. I mean, one of them is to kind of literally be human shields. Like Iran does not want to hit U.S. soldiers because they do not want the escalation ladder to go up. they did their response. They said, this is it, as long as we are not hit back. By the U.S. sending soldiers there, it's saying, when we attack you, and you have to respond back, as you've said you would do, versus walking away as you pledged, you might hit an American soldier. And if you hit an American soldier, things are going to continue to get worse for you, because the U.S. doctrine is, we got to respond if there's an American that's harmed. I mean, that's where it's been under the Biden administration. But the other side of it, other than just kind of the literal use of soldiers, as human shields here, is it's like a propaganda and psychological operation purpose. It is for the United States and the White House in particular to say, it's not just about money that we will support Israel with. It's not just about weapons that we will support Israel with. We are willing to sacrifice American lives for the benefit of Israel. And so the deployment of these soldiers really should be seen in that context. It's upping the ante in a way that hasn't been for the past year, and for historically in the U.S.-Israeli relationship. I mean, the THAAD missile system was there several years ago in 2019 as like a joint training operation, but now putting them on the actual battlefield in anticipation of missiles coming in, which could kill and injure U.S. soldiers, knowing that leads to broader escalation. I mean, those are the things that are really behind this deployment, and I think why people should be concerned.
Mike, I am curious, I've always read about the fact that among the American military, Israel is not seen as necessarily so popular. It's seen as kind of being, in the way of American objectives. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that does seem to be like a common point, especially among, certain generals who've later gone on to write books. And then something else I've noticed among those who from, the American military who write about Israel is often they're a bit stunned by the brutality of the Israelis, which I think is saying a lot coming from the Americans. A few weeks back after, Hassan Nasrallah, the late leader of Hezbollah, was killed in the southern suburbs of Beirut by the Israelis using 85 2,000-pound U.S. supplied bunker buster bombs. There was an article in like a Navy magazine by this U.S. Air Force guy, who was noting that in the entire invasion of Iraq and the war against the Iraqi military, the U.S. used a total of 23 of those bunker buster bombs. And then he noted that the kind of shock that Israel used 3 times that many in a single night to kill Hassan Nasrallah. And I mean, he was very diplomatic in how he framed it. It was along the lines of, it's really interesting. The Israelis seem to have a higher appetite for collateral damage than the U.S. military does. So I'm just curious if you could kind of speak to some of that. What is Israel in the Israeli military a popular force among U.S. military personnel in your experience? And what do you have to say about the fact that you are someone who went to Iraq and you saw the brutality of the U.S. military, and the fact that you have U.S. military personnel looking at what Israel's doing and kind of maybe even being a little bit horrified by the brutality of it?
Sure. Well, I think, the U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq was like the great crime of the modern era. And the horror stories and the legacy is, it's hard to overstate the crime that was done to the Iraqi people in that country. But in context of the Israeli genocide, I mean, if you look at the worst single atrocities of the Iraq War era, like the big scandals that came out, like the Abu Ghraib torture scandal, the Haditha massacre, the sieges of Fallujah, and all of these things that were incredibly brutal and criminal. The stories coming out of Gaza and Lebanon now of actions by the Israeli military, it really kind of puts it to shame in a lot of ways. Just the levels that Israel has gone to has far surpassed a large amount of the brutality waged by the United States in Iraq. And because the U.S. officials, military officials and Washington kind of always had to play this game with the Iraq War in particular, where they needed to use kind of brute force to smash the will of the Iraqi people to not be occupied. But they had to maintain this kind of international acceptance and not become a pariah state, and to maintain some kind of legitimacy in accordance with international law. And so they always, when there were scandals, they had to fire people or arrest people and apologize and do investigations and right the wrongs and things like that. Of course, a lot of cover-ups and outsourcing a lot of these things to secret black operations. So the worst things that were happening were things that would never come to light versus just having conventional forces do them. Israel doesn't care about that. Israel doesn't have to worry about international public opinion or domestic public opinion because the vast majority agree with it, whereas the Bush administration and then Obama had a different situation to worry about in the United States. Israel knows that it doesn't matter what it does. It can lie about why it does them. It can make up some excuse. And it doesn't matter how many countries in the world line up against it or recognize that reality. The United States will back it up no matter what, which is, I think, what the Trump administration and then the Biden administration and then whoever wins this election, Harris and Trump, have both signaled it does not matter what Israel does. We will support them to the hilt. And so it's really just Israel is doing what the U.S. would have done if they had the opportunity to be completely unbridled and not worry about any international backlash or legitimacy issues whatsoever. And so, yeah, I mean, the appetite for brutality, I think, is something that is constantly stunning people. And, that's, I think, a huge factor here, which I go back to what I said before, why American troops who have been sent to Israel, should be worried. Netanyahu would love it if American troops were wounded or killed on that deployment, because that means that the U.S. will increase its participation to an even greater degree. When U.S. forces were killed in Jordan, the 3 U.S. soldiers who were killed earlier this year, the United States stepped up attacks on those militias that carried it out that are the ones that are attacking Israeli military targets as well. And so those American soldiers being in harm's way and being hurt or killed is very, very good for Israel and very good for Netanyahu's plan. And so that would give me a little bit of nervousness if I was one of those soldiers on that mission. But back to your point, Ronnie, about just the overall perception of this in the U.S. military. It's people, I think, are expect when they join the military that they're going to, sacrifice themselves for their country, not another country, Israel. And so I would say more so than the discontent over U.S. policy in general, but backing up an Israeli war is probably the reason why there is kind of a much larger number of people who are trying to get out of the military and quitting in protest than there has been in previous years.
Well, I'm glad you raised that point because obviously we see, on many different levels, the U.S. becoming more deeply embroiled. I mean, the use of the B-2 bomber to bomb Yemen. And I'm, obviously we saw Aaron Bushnell. We've seen other things. And I was going to ask you exactly that question. I mean, what are you picking up in terms of opposition inside the U.S. military around all of this, as it feels like the U.S. is either getting sucked in or deliberately stepping in more and more to the broader conflict?
Yeah, well, I think it's it's worrisome that I think the Harris campaign has kind of hit Trump specifically on not attacking Iran more. Trump, we know, issued a very hawkish policy towards Iran, destroying the Iran nuclear deal, imposing new sanctions, carrying out the brazen assassination of Iran's most popular figure, Qasem Soleimani. But when Iran gave him a get-out-of-jail-free card saying, hey, we got to respond to this, we're just going to do this attack on this base. Nobody's seriously injured. Nobody's killed. Let's walk away. Gave him an out. The Harris campaign, we saw this both in the vice presidential debate, and it's repeated constantly by Harris on the campaign trail, hitting Trump for not escalating from that point on. And we know Trump is running, Harris is running to the right of Biden. Trump is running to the right of Trump 2020. And so whoever's going to be coming in, it's a very worrisome situation in terms of where this is all going to lead and spiral out of control into. I think that in terms of what U.S. service members must be thinking and feeling right now, not people who are kind of directly involved with this deployment of this THAAD battery, but just people who are in the military at all, and now knowing that the role is not even just aircraft transporting stuff. And I've talked to service members whose job it was to operate the cargo aircraft that are transporting weapons to Israel, who have quit their careers after long careers and become conscientious objectors. I know at least 2 people who had this kind of direct role in the transportation of weapons, who have then quit their positions and are getting out of the military now. But with direct U.S. involvement, I think whenever someone, people in the military who are becoming politically conscious or who are following the Israeli genocide, which is a larger number than ever before, just like it is in broader U.S. society, there is the recognition that the US going and providing, even if they believe it's just defensive capabilities, it is enabling the Israeli military to carry out these acts of genocide. And whatever the latest horror is that people are seeing on their feeds, the burning of patients in their hospital beds while they're hooked up to IVs, US troops being there helps Israel do that more. Because by sending US forces to play a military role, that frees up Israeli military forces to focus more on committing the horrors that they are committing in Gaza. And so that is not a difficult conclusion to come to, that I think a lot of people in the military are smart enough to come to that conclusion. The thing that they really need to think about, if there's any of them watching, is right now it is very easy to get out of the military as a conscientious objector. It's extremely easy. I mean, you got to wait about 6 months, but if you put in your paperwork, you do it right by working with the GI Rights Hotline, you're going to get out, you're going to get an honorable discharge. If things continue to escalate, if there is a broader regional war that the U.S. is more directly involved in, the U.S. military commands in all the branches of service and all the bases across the country, they're going to start becoming a lot more strict with those conscientious objector packets. We're going to start denying a lot more of those conscientious objector packets. So, those who are following this and are kind of concerned about potentially playing a role, now's the time to really exercise your rights, because there could very likely be a moment where things change dramatically. And, then if you want to get out, you're going to have to do it the harder way versus the easy ways that are available to you now.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I actually, before we wrap this, I want to ask you one more question, Mike, because I think it's really important to emphasize this as this continues to escalate. And the more Israel escalates this with U.S. backing, the higher the likelihood, of an actual U.S. hot war that requires tens of thousands, if not more, of U.S. troops in the region to fight yet another war against Iran, against Hezbollah in Lebanon, all across the region. And, I think that when we think about the organization of Hamas and the fact that they are still fighting after a year of genocide, of being stuck in this death camp of Gaza that is it's flat. It's like flat beach land. It's surrounded by all sides, by air, land, and sea, under complete Israeli siege. Yet for a year, this organization, the Al-Qassam Brigades and its allies in this tiny, densely populated strip of land on the coast has managed to continue fighting, continuing to destroy Israeli tanks, to continue to kill Israeli soldiers, and every so often fire missiles into Israel. I think because the propaganda around this and the level of death and destruction in Gaza has convinced a lot of people that Hamas is like nothing, and that maybe the entire resistance axis in the region is nothing. But just from a military point of view, could you just quickly go through the actual forces that would be at play if this were to turn into the big war that everybody's so scared of? Because this will lead to casualties for everyone. Hamas is exacting casualties. We don't really hear about it. Hezbollah is exacting a lot of casualties on the Israelis because they're a much more powerful organization. Iran is a country with a military and air defenses. So this is not like some cakewalk as the Israelis are trying to make us believe it is in Gaza and would be across the rest of the region.
Sure. Well, I think that the Pentagon in particular, doesn't really want to be entering into a big conventional war with Iran or Lebanon or Gaza. That's kind of why it likes Israel so much, is because Israel can act in its place and carry out violence and aggression and attacks against all of these countries and movements that the U.S. very much wants destroyed. It very much wants these regime change and the political leaders killed and these movements to be eviscerated and have these countries, Lebanon, Palestine, Iran, run by kind of U.S. puppets and U.S. proxies. And so the U.S. very much wants the destruction of these countries and their political movement, but it would much prefer that Israel is the one to do it. And that's kind of what we've seen behind the U.S. strategy of support for Israel. But now that the introduction of U.S. troops, if we look at the Vietnam War, if we look at the war in Afghanistan, if we look at the war in Iraq, all of these wars started with saying, we're just sending a small number of troops. That's it. Stop worrying. This is not going to become a big war. And in all of those cases, they didn't actually want it to become a big war, and they didn't want to end up sending large numbers of troops over many, many years, and with incurring devastating casualties on their own forces. Those were never like in the plans of Washington and the Pentagon when those things started. But just the nature of the system we live under, it's just a path that they will go down if that's where the path leads them. I mean, the United States has shown that it is completely capable and willing to initiate a conflict, to start bombing a country, and then do that for decades. To bomb a country for 20 years, to sanction it into starvation, to kill people relentlessly, to blockade it, to fund destabilization in the country, and then, sacrifice both its own soldiers and the civilians of that country and on some kind of hapless mission. And then when they've had enough, when it doesn't work out the way they wanted, where they succeed, or if it blows up in their face, either way, they didn't just walk away and move on and then go to the next country. Doing this in many cases, like Eugene, you brought up Yemen, doing this against movements, and Rania, to your point about Gaza still having a strong resistance movement, despite the hell that Israel has unleashed on it. The U.S. opens up these campaigns of just mass destruction against peoples that refuse to be defeated, and so at the end of it, the U.S. walks away virtually unscathed, having put a bunch of destruction on these people, and some sector of U.S. forces that become amputees or come home in coffins because of it. But this is a system that just kind of throws its hands up and then walks on to the next thing. There's never any justice. There's never any reparations or anything like that of the people that were in charge of the debacle and all of that stuff. And so that's a dangerous scenario to be in when we have a government and a system that does this thing all the time with always disastrous consequences, and always consequences that escalate to a point that nobody expected in the first place. And so that's what we have ahead of us, and that people should be, I think, concerned about and active around.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, as always, Mike Prysner, really appreciate your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eugene.
Yeah.
So, to what I was asking Mike about, I think it's really important to reflect on the fact that after more than a year now of genocide in Gaza, the Israelis keep doing these victory laps. Yes, they may have I still don't know if the resistance side has confirmed Yahya Sinwar was killed or not. The Israelis are saying it was him. We see some photos that do look like him. And if it did go down as the Israelis say, they're once again taking a victory lap. But here's the thing. The Qassam brigades are named after a man with the last name Qassam. Okay, that's because he was also killed. The leaders of Hamas have always been killed. When you become a leader of Hamas or a leader in Hezbollah, part of the expectation is that you may in fact be assassinated. So every time the Israelis assassinate or kill one of these leaders, the organization still continues to function because these organizations are not built to function because of one person. This is a well-organized military that has a horizontal kind of organization where even when someone like Hassan Nasrallah is killed, as huge as a blow as that is, we see that nearly a month later, Hezbollah is not only still intact, it seems to be still quite powerful. It's able to fire like mid-range missiles at Israel. It's able to kill Israeli soldiers trying to invade Lebanon. The biggest force of Israeli soldiers ever to be at the Lebanese border right now. And they haven't really managed to invade yet because of the fierce resistance being put up by Hezbollah fighters. And again, a year after the genocide in Gaza began, a year after October 7th, you see Hamas still fighting, still exacting casualties, still firing missiles. Have they been weakened? They certainly have, because they've been dealing with a genocide for a year. But I can tell you nobody, even their allies in the region, predicted they're into this, they would still be functioning. I remember back in last October, people were saying they have about 6 to 9 months worth of, ammunition and food and just all the things that you would need to continue this sort of fight. They're still going. So the Israelis can do a million victory laps. It's never going to stop. The point at the end of the day is that this isn't about one person. This isn't about Yahya Sinwar. It's not about Mohammed Deif. It's not about Hassan Nasrallah. This is about a genocidal, expansionist, colonial state that Its ambitions mean they have to kill and kill and kill around the clock in perpetuity to reach their objectives. And as long as that is their motive for existing, as long as they need to kill and kill and kill the native inhabitants of the lands they want to steal, there is going to be fierce resistance to that. And that resistance has only grown increasingly powerful. The resistance today is more powerful than it has ever been in the history of resistance to Israeli colonialism. So for all these delusional idiots who are running around and, chanting that this is some sort of victory because they've killed the leaders of these movements still exist. They're still militarily intact and they're still fighting, and they're going to keep fighting because as long as they exist, as long as they haven't been fully exterminated, and they haven't been, they are going to keep fighting for their survival. And more of them who are traumatized by the hell Israel has unleashed on their lives are going to feel more motivated than ever to fire at their oppressor. That's never going to change.
No, I think it's a well-taken point. I mean, of course, Izzadin al-Qassam was one of the great Palestinian leaders in the 1930s in the uprisings against the British and the Zionists, who also fought against the French in Syria, who also built support in the Levant area for the struggle of the Libyan people against the Italians. So it speaks to this overall piece, I think, that you're saying, Rania, that this is a struggle that, of course, didn't begin on October 7th, but began over 100 years ago with the Balfour Declaration and the attempt to colonize the region and the broader attempts to colonize the Arab world. And so, many things have changed over the years in terms of who the main forces, the main figures, the main political parties, but it's been a constant because, of course, oppression breeds resistance. And there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, that is, in fact, the case. And you see the signs of it everywhere. I mean, just since I'm raising the issue of al-Qassam and Libya, a lot of the fighting in the early part of the war in Gaza was around Umar Mukhtar Street, which in the Gaza City area, which, is, of course, the great anti-colonial leader of the Libyan people. So, there's all these touchstones of resistance that we hit on when we even say some of these names. So, yeah, I think that this is the strategy of assassination. They've always been assassinating these leaders, as you pointed out. They thought well, anyway, I won't repeat what you just said. They always think that, this is going to be the final piece. And I think there's also an element of this, too, that, you never know how things are going to happen. But in the context of warfare, in the context of military campaigns, the most successful commanders historically tend to be people who are known for leading from the front, so to speak. People who do not leave it just to the lower ranks to be fighting and dying, but are there and are in the midst and the thick of the battle. And if it's true what they're saying about Mr. Sinwar, if these photos that are circulating are true, then you can obviously see that he was leading from the front. So insofar as some people may think, this is a big blow, it also could be something that could lift the morale of many of the rank and file fighters, I think, in Gaza, because it shows that, their leadership is right there with them, which I think is the exact type of thing that tends to bind people more to their cause, more to their organizations, more to their militaries and their armies. And I think that is also a factor that is never really considered by the Israelis. Their constant terrorism, their constant attempts, is they feel if they kill enough, appointed leaders, that then they will be able to kill an idea and to kill the cause. And it's just not possible. There's been Islamist groups, communist groups, nationalist groups. The Palestinian people in general, no matter what the ideology behind it, have always resisted. And they've actually always resisted around a multitude of different views. And in fact, always united significantly across many political differences to be able to fight against the occupation and, of course, now the genocide. So, of course, Hamas has not spoken. So there is always a chance that perhaps there's another angle to this story, but certainly it does feel that there is a lot of evidence here on one side. So I think that's why we're speaking relatively definitively here. I think it is important to note that it is only the Israelis and the Americans now confirming this. Of course, Kamala Harris saying justice has been served, Rania. But nonetheless, I don't want people to think we're just, ignoring the fact that the resistance forces in Palestine and elsewhere have yet to speak on this, but just speaking on what we know, and I think the implications based on what it could be, assuming that this is true. And also, just to note, this is happening in the ongoing reality of Gaza. Multiple camps have been hit today. A very large number of people. I can't get the exact numbers right away in front of me, but dozens of people, it seems, have been killed in a few of these strikes. So that's also a big ongoing part of this, I think. I mean, obviously, we're talking about the whole sort of geopolitics angle, the regional politics, what this could really mean, but that the ongoing just carpet bombing of Gaza is continuing unabated right now. And I think that just deserves to be said as we move forward in this piece and we see what the ultimate aftermath of this ends up being.
Yeah, and I just want to say something. I never pretend to be objective when it comes to such horrific levels of injustice, and I'm so happy that at Breakthrough we don't have to sit here and pretend objectivity exists, especially when it comes to genocide. But this is very close to home for me. I'm Lebanese. I live in Lebanon. I don't see Palestine as different than Lebanon. I mean, these are tiny little areas that were chopped up by Europeans, by the French and the British, who drew borders and disconnected us and stole our land. And I just have to say that, just as a person from the region, I have been made to feel throughout my life in the US to feel ashamed of where I come from, because it's full of terrorists who just hate and are weird and are conservative and are gross and are religious. And I mean, that's literally what you're conditioned to feel as an Arab growing up in America. And I think a lot of minority people from different parts of the global South who end up growing up in the US have similar feelings towards whatever stereotype is like shoved down their throats growing up in the US. But I just have to say that I feel nothing but absolute pride in where I come from and where my family comes from. And the fact that there are people willing to sacrifice their lives to protect their land and to fight for their land. And people are always going to do that. If there's anything we've learned from 8 decades of attempted colonization, destruction of who I consider to be my people, if we've learned anything, it's that you have not destroyed, not you, Eugene, obviously, but like imperialism has not destroyed them. It has not exterminated them. And there are horrors taking place right now that are really devastating and demoralizing and really make you feel helpless. But at the end of the day, one thing that we know for certain is that people will never stop fighting against the occupation, colonization, invasion, destruction, and theft of their land. And I just am absolutely proud to come from a region that has not submitted to that. That's all I want to say.
A good note to end that piece of the conversation on then. I think that's a very well taken point. We're going to move the show forward here. We want to turn our attention, well, we're not really turning our attention, same basic issue here, but, some of what's been happening on the diplomatic front more broadly between Iran, countries in the Gulf Cooperation Council, how that fits into everything happening in West Asia now. We are very, very honored to be joined once again here by Giorgio Caffaro, who is the CEO of Gulf State Analytics. Giorgio, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Good to be with you guys.
Well, great to have you here to sort through all of this. And I guess the first question I want to ask you is, we've seen a lot of Iranian sort of diplomacy, in the sense people I'm sure have seen the foreign minister flying around to different countries. And I wonder, what you think their overall strategy is in approaching many of these Gulf states with the sort of Damocles sword of the Israeli response to their missile attacks happening, and how are you viewing the response we've seen from some of the GCC countries that they've been engaging with?
Yeah, good question. So obviously on the 1st of this month, we had the 2-wave ballistic missile attack that Iran carried out against Israel. And for the past 16 days, the Iranians have been preparing for the expected Israeli retaliation. And Iran has sort of been responding to these circumstances and these threats in sort of a multidimensional way. On one hand, there are these concerns that Iran has about some Arab states potentially assisting the U.S. and/or Israel in what might be a military operation that targets the Iranian homeland or Iranian interests throughout the region. when it comes to the GCC states, the two main concerns in this respect would be that some of the Gulf states permit the Israeli fighter jets to use their airspace, or that some U.S. military bases in the Gulf could be used for such an operation. So the Iranians have been very clear to the 6 GCC states that if there is any sort of cooperation between them and the U.S.-Israeli alliance against Iran in some upcoming attack, that Iran will make them pay a very, very high price. And the Iranians in the past, as we know, we discussed on this show before, back in September 2019, there was the huge attack on the Saudi Aramco facilities. So everyone in the Gulf remembers that episode. Everyone in the GCC knows how easy it would be for Iran and its allies to target the energy infrastructure of the GCC countries. Their economies are totally dependent on oil and gas. So the Iranians know where the GCC states are vulnerable, and they've made it very clear that any cooperation between a GCC country and Israel or the US in such an act of retaliation would come with serious consequences. But at the same time, in recent years, we've seen even the most anti-Iranian members of the GCC, chiefly Saudi Arabia, make huge progress in terms of improving and warming their relations with Iran. So at the same time, the Iranian message to Saudi Arabia and others in the GCC is that if you respect our interests, we will also respect your interests. And we are very interested in continuing to improve our relations, but that obviously requires not doing anything to assist the Americans or Israelis in some sort of a military operation against Iran. And in sort of a grander context too, I think Iran is trying now more than ever to push for a de-escalation of the conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon. And in that context, we saw the Iranian foreign minister visit Oman, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. So 6 Arab states this month. And I think this is about sort of rallying more regional support in favor of a ceasefire both in Gaza and Lebanon. The Iranians definitely do not want these conflicts to continue and to further regionalize and internationalize for Iran's own interests.
I mean, definitely, I think a lot of people have their eye on the GCC states and have for this entire year. And there's been a lot of outrage and anger that they haven't done more, and questions of, okay, they have all this oil. Why haven't they leveraged it? They have these U.S. bases that they host. Why haven't they leveraged their willingness to host them? So why do you think the GCC states have been so reluctant to use their leverage to basically get the U.S. to rein in the Israelis? And then maybe I should be asking the question is, do they even have the leverage that we think they do?
Well, the GCC states have different perspectives on questions about Israeli normalization. The different members of the GCC have different perspectives on groups in the axis of resistance. For example, Qatar and UAE have very different perspectives on Hamas. So they obviously have their own unique interests, but what they all have in common is a whole host of concerns about what will happen to the region if the conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon continue, not only in Gaza and Lebanon, but if they further regionalize into the Red Sea, Yemen, elsewhere in the Middle East. So they have been very frustrated with the United States for not using its leverage over Israel to sort of pull the plug on the Netanyahu government and get these conflicts to wind down. This is a huge source of frustration among all of the Arab states in the Gulf, and it is changing the ways in which they look at U.S. leadership on the international stage. The issue, though, getting to your question, is that they don't have the leverage to either rein in the United States or Israel, and they find themselves rather vulnerable to these dynamics. At the same time, all 6 GCC members, at the end of the day, do rely on the United States as their security guarantor, and therefore, like I said, there's a real limit as to how much influence they have, but they nonetheless remain very vulnerable to these intensifying conflict dynamics in the region.
I'm glad you raised the point about, the U.S. being sort of the bottom line security guarantor. And I guess it just makes me wonder, it's picking up on a theme you raised earlier, the Saudi-Iran rapprochement that's been developing over time, that China has been developing how real is that? Do you think the momentum towards that is moving closer? And is perhaps the desire to be less dependent on others outside the region in terms of security something behind the Saudi desire to sort of bridge this gap?
The fact that over a year has gone by since October 7th, 2023, and the Saudi-Iran detente is still on track really underscores the extent to which both Riyadh and Tehran have vested interests in maintaining this better relationship. Obviously, there's still a tremendous amount of distrust between the Saudi and Iranian governments, but they both, even if for different reasons, they both have an interest in preventing the relationship from being hostile. The Iranians, for their part, sort of accept that the US sanctions, the European sanctions, are probably going to remain in place for a long time. So to counter the effects of Western pressure, Tehran has really invested in this foreign policy strategy called Neighbors First, which entails improving ties with all of Iran's neighbors, including Saudi Arabia and other Arab states in the neighborhood. Saudi Arabia is really focused on its own economic development and diversification at home, and of course conflicts that involve Iran and potential Iranian-backed operations against Saudi Arabia can undermine the Saudi leadership's vision for developing the kingdom. So for these reasons, they want to maintain the normalization of relations and really mitigate and control the tensions. It was really remarkable. 2 days after the ballistic missile attack that Iran carried out against Israel, the Iranian president and Saudi foreign minister met in Doha, and the Saudi official made it very clear. In his own words, he basically said, we want to take the remaining issues of tension between our two countries and resolve them and start a new chapter based on brotherly relations. What I think we need to sort of take away from the past 19 months, 20 months or so of detente is that the Saudis realized that the U.S. pressure on Iran was not making the kingdom any more secure, and that ultimately for Saudi Arabia to feel more secure in relation to what Riyadh perceives as the Iranian threat, you get there through dialogue and cooperation and diplomacy, not pressure, not confrontation.
It does seem to be, when you think about what's actually taking place in the region, all we ever hear about is Iran's malign influence. But when you actually look at who's doing what, the destruction is coming from really one side. But I want to turn for a moment to Turkey, Giorgio, because, Turkey has had harsh words for Israel, very strong words against Israel since all this started. But everyone always makes the point that these words don't mean a lot because Erdogan still maintains relations with the Israelis. Do you think that this might change as this escalates? And also, I could add to that, perhaps Turkey might even see some opportunities here. I know there's a lot of speculation from people in the region that, given that Israel's on what it perceives to be a winning streak, perhaps Syria would be in the crosshairs. And all those rebel groups will be reactivated, which is something that Turkey played a pretty big role in helping with. So where do you see Turkey going from here with regard to the genocide in Gaza, the escalating war on Lebanon, escalation with Iran, and potential to kind of re-destroy Syria?
Well, it's always important to consider the role that Turkey plays in the region, being an influential Muslim country, also a member of NATO, and a country that has very deep economic relations with the Arab states, Israel, and European states. So I think to answer this question, it's important to realize that since the current party ruling Turkey, the AKP, has been in power, there have definitely been previous episodes in which tensions between Ankara and Tel Aviv got quite nasty. I'm sure all your viewers remember the flotilla incident of 2010. And during those previous episodes, there was very harsh rhetoric from Erdogan and others in the Turkish leadership. But aside from the rhetoric, there were always deep economic relations between Israel and Turkey that proved resilient. So we always had to distinguish between sort of political statements and then the economics of the bilateral relationship. Earlier this year, Turkey announced a trade embargo on Israel, which seemed to suggest that this current crisis in bilateral relations was playing out differently. I have no doubt that the trade between the two countries has taken a huge hit, and the embargo should not be dismissed as totally insignificant. But I'll caveat that with 2 points. Is one is there is trade that still continues. It just goes through other countries such as Greece. This is something that a number of media outlets have documented, and there are some youth groups, some pro-Palestine groups in Turkey that have spoken about the fact that trade is still going on through, I guess, Greek ports. And then also at the same time, there's the factor of Azerbaijani energy that we need to keep in mind. Azerbaijan and Israel have a very close relationship going back to the 1990s, right after the Soviet Union imploded. And Israel has depended very much on Azerbaijan's hydrocarbon exports. And I believe that when this year began, the Israelis sourced 20% of their oil imports from Azerbaijan. And at some point this year, that number jumped up to 40. Point being, Israel and its war machine have very much depended on Azerbaijani oil. That oil, as we all know, there's no border between Israel and Azerbaijan. That oil goes from Azerbaijan through Georgia, through Turkey, and then through the Mediterranean to Haifa. The Turkish government could cut off that flow if it wanted to. The thing is, Turkey and Azerbaijan have a very, very close alliance. There are few alliances in the world as close as the one between Ankara and Baku. And I think the reason why, at least one of the reasons why, the leadership in Turkey has not cut off that flow of Azerbaijani oil to Israel is because that would have a very negative impact on Azerbaijan's economy. That being said, there is a lot of pressure, sort of bottom-up pressure from different groups and individuals in Turkey who are saying it's very shameful that we allow this oil to come through our country into Israel, and we have the leverage to cut it off. And there is a growing push on the Turkish leadership to do so. The longer the genocide goes on in Gaza, I think that pressure is going to intensify. I'm not necessarily predicting that it's going to result in Ankara making that move, which would be very significant. But again, point being, there's going to be more pressure from the Turkish citizens on the leadership in Turkey to do that. We'll have to see how that plays out.
Oh,
You helping
Eugene's
us sort?
muted. Oh, never mind. We can hear you now. You were muted
Sorry.
for
Well,
Eugene.
thank you. I appreciate that. And I can't even unmute myself. Anyway, Giorgio, as always, it's a pleasure to have you here to sort through it all. Thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Good to be with you.
Well, Eugene,
Rania?
I mean, the Gulf states, just a bunch of rich monarchies with all the luxuries in the world. Some interfere more than others. It'll be interesting next to see how they treat the situation in Lebanon, because a lot of them have kind of like disengaged with Lebanon over the crisis years since 2019. But now we see some that are reemerging with excitement. For example, the Emiratis are coming and saying perhaps they can start funding the Lebanese army in a post-Hezbollah Lebanon. So all the vultures are circling the wagon. What's the saying? Sorry.
Well, actually, those are two totally separate sayings. Circling the wagons and vultures circling over a dead carcass are not the same thing at all. But nonetheless.
You know what? You're welcome. I am just as human as the rest of you.
Yeah, well,
you're welcome for the entertainment.
Let's go ahead and circle the wagons here on the Freedom Side on Breakthrough News and see if we can get through the rest of this show. We are going to turn our attention to the, wow, let me just take a second here.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to everybody.
It's okay. No need to apologize. A lot going on. We want to turn our attention here to the U.S. presidential election. last stretch here, last few weeks, Kamala Harris has been floundering a little bit in the polls in different states and in different contexts. And there's a lot of conversation about the Democrats losing ground with key constituencies, particularly in the African-American community, but also in the labor movement and other places. And obviously the impact of the war on Gaza, the economy in general, on their appeal, and also the possibility of Trump winning. So anyway, to get into as much of this as we can, we are very, very honored to be joined here once again on the show by Lawrence Grand Prix, who is the Director of Research at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, which is a grassroots think tank in Baltimore City, Maryland. Lawrence, as always, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you here. And I guess the first question I want to ask you, and I know you saw it, the New York Times, had a big article out earlier this week, or I think it was earlier this week, into last week, about the drop in support for Democrats among Black voters. They noted that, based on the polling where we are since 2016, according to them, about a 22% drop in sort of net support for amongst Black people for Democrats over Republicans. So pretty big drop. There's a number of other numbers in there. There's a whole broader conversation, but just sticking with that sort of general statistic, I wonder, what you think is behind that.
So looking at some of the research from 2020, turnout in places like Philadelphia, Milwaukee was actually down in 2020 compared to 2016, despite a massive increase nationwide in turnout. And I attribute that to middle class, poor Black folks, despite the rhetoric of Black folks saving democracy, not being engaged with the Democratic Party platform. Joe Biden, of course, the architect of the crime bill. Now we have Kamala Harris, former prosecutor, and someone who, again, is not actually reflecting the needs of the Black community in terms of investing in jobs that are worth doing, jobs that are unionized, economic and power redistribution. We're looking at a Black community that feels taken for granted. And we're seeing softening not only in the Black male vote, but also the Black female percentage. Some of that might be religion stuff with the abortion debate. But I think it's also just there's a class dynamic within the Black female woman community, that working class and poor Black women who are seeing the impacts of mass incarceration. Like, the platform that she put out really had nothing that was restorative of that harm except cannabis legalization, which the way that she would probably do it would not be restorative at all. So it really is people desperate to want to believe in this Democratic Party that our grandparents really brought us into with stories of the civil rights movement. But looking at the conditions of the community, I'm here in West Baltimore Park Heights, and, abandoned homes, and the only solution we get is gentrification, And so if it's gentrification or nothing, and we are the party of gentrification, the Democratic Party tied to the universities, the hospitals that drive all the gentrification, and the nonprofit industrial complex, it feels so hard for working class Black people to deeply connect to what the party is offering. And I think that's part of why you're seeing that softening of support.
Some could make the argument that this has been going on with the Democratic Party for a very long time. It has, right? Like, their solutions all sound the same. They're empty slogans. They never follow through on them. In fact, sometimes they don't even give us slogans in the case of Kamala Harris. I haven't heard her address the issue of incarceration at all, or police brutality. I've only heard her say that she wants to increase the number of Border Patrol officers and deport more. If we're going to talk about anything when it comes to criminal justice system issues. Also, she has a very fraught history when it comes to that system in particular, being the top cop in California. But I'm just curious, why it's different this time around, right? Because it's the same sort of right-wing Democratic Party with the same corporate solutions that aren't actually solutions, that aren't really addressing the needs of working class people. So what's different this time around? Because if you read the media, I've even seen the argument be made by some liberals, which is, I got to even repeat it, like, makes me cringe. But this is the argument you see, is that it's just that Black men don't like a strong Black woman. I don't know if you've seen that argument, but that's one that's being parroted on the interwebs, which, I obviously don't buy. But yeah, what's going on here this time around that's different from, for example, when Hillary Clinton was running? Or is this a part of an ongoing trend about the Democratic Party?
So I've seen that talking point as well. Of course, it was presented by Barack Obama, saying, when he spoke to, quote, the brothers, that we need to not be afraid of a strong sister. The reality is it's almost the exact same polling we saw was Biden and Trump. I remember that being a freak out in 2020, about 20% of black men potentially voting for Trump. The reality was, about 11%, which is about the standard. I think there is a lot of concern about the rise of the black manosphere. The joke was the CIA dropped off podcast equipment in the hood to destroy black communities. And there was just all this rise of podcasting and YouTubing during the pandemic. So now we're seeing more exposure to black men who are articulating perspectives that many women not only find wrong, but perplexing. And I do think there is a degree of gender disintegration economically, where black women have been more integrated into some components of the nonprofit industrial complex, some components of, especially here in Baltimore, government jobs, federal jobs, in a way that black men haven't, with the loss of construction work, large-scale public projects. So even with the transportation bill, that transportation bill was, a couple billion, or a couple trillion. They were talking about a $10 trillion infrastructure bill 10 years ago. So the ability for black men to find space in the economy can lead to some resentment. A lot of those folks don't vote, and they didn't vote before. So we're seeing a disconnect between what looks like a rise in black male resentment and conservatism. In reality, if that just has not been borne out electorally, because a lot of those folks don't vote and never do vote. Some of them vote independent, some of them vote libertarian, and there's just so many black men who just vote Democrat because that's what their aunts tell them to do. That's what their cousins tell them to do, but they don't got no podcasts. So we have a disconnect between, that reality. But again, it begs the question of, do they deserve to vote? There was no connection at all in that agenda between domestic black issues and foreign policy. No understanding that black folks of all genders could be saying, look what's happening in Lebanon, look what's happening in Gaza. I can't put my name on that. I can't put my credibility on that. And the fact that they were not connected to, I think, is demonstrative of that inability to take black people as a people with moral consciousness seriously.
I think that's an amazing point. In fact, that was one of the things that stood out to most of me in the New York Times poll is, it was a majority of black voters overall, but under 30 of the respondents, 71% said that they agreed with the phrase, we should pay less attention to problems overseas and concentrate on problems here at home. But of course, it's always stated that anything overseas is like a non-black issue, and that, has its own its own history to it as well. And I guess it just speaks to maybe a broader point that I think you're making here, but I'd like to hear you expand on, is also like sort of the caricature of black voters, men and women. Like we've had this, sort of media, political complex sort of define what black issues are, develop the Charlemagne the gods of the world to be the interlocutors we're all supposed to believe are the, this is the gateway to what black people really want. And it just seems like the deeper you dig into, not only our own anecdotal experiences as being black all our lives, but the actual facts and statistics, that a lot of that picture is not really the pulse of the community.
I couldn't agree more. I believe that it's amazing that one of the main issues they trot out is voting rights. So the only reason you vote is to protect your right to vote. It's a massive circular argument that only feeds the Democratic Party. We're a captured electorate. They depend so desperately on black turnout, and they get these 90%, 90-10 splits with black voters they don't get anywhere else, and they feel entitled to them. Any possibility of losing that, it's like, how dare you betray me? When in reality, again, thinking the complexity and the heterogeneity of the black population, we're increasingly becoming secular. So the caricature of the black souls to the polls, the black chat's complex. And with that black church vote, it's becoming more evangelical than traditional Baptist. So some of those folks may have issues with some of the reproductive justice stuff. And that's black women, right? But that challenges our caricatures of black women as what we're being presented as the Kamala Harris, the black Greek sorority, yes, queen, souls to the polls type folks. Those people exist, but they're also just massive swaths of black folks, especially black men who are maybe formerly incarcerated, addicted, or disconnected from the traditional economy. Not only do they not turn out, Becky Pettit's book, Invisible Men, talks about the way we do our surveying actually massively overcounts the percentage of poor working class black men who do turn out. So black men turnout, when you actually look at it, can be as low as 20, 35% when we're calling it 50%. There's so many people who I see that as them actively voting no. I will not put my name into this system. I am voting no, that I reject the legitimacy of this system. That is a political act that's being read as political apathy.
I am curious because there's also this narrative that Black people are increasingly supporting Trump. And I don't know if there's any truth to that. I don't know if there's just because you're not enthusiastic anymore as much about the Democratic Party doesn't necessarily mean you're voting for Republican. So I guess my question here is two-pronged. Is there growing support for the Republican Party and Donald Trump inside the Black community, which is what I think someone like, for example, Candace Owens is kind of, ambitiously pushing for with her platforms? And also, is there growing support in certain sectors of the Black community for the idea of third-party voting?
So I would say only at the margins. The vast majority of Black folks, whether we like it or not, are loyal Democrats. I don't know if I mentioned this, but I actually was on the college debate team with Nate Cohen, who does the polling at New York Times. So just in college, I just had a large engagement with polling through knowing him. And the polling is pretty consistent. There is some young Black progressive engagement with the Green Party and the Socialist Party that is real, but maybe more at the margins in big cities. Many of those are in blue states. And I will say there is a hustle grind set culture, especially amongst younger Black men, that has been more traditionally affiliated with the Republican Party. Now, whether that crosses over to Trump, I don't know. And I don't think it is this massive influence. What we know is, and this is what's happening, these are media people who are terrified that there are Black folks on YouTube that can get hundreds of thousands of millions of views that are not gatekept by them. So they're terrified by that. My experience is that typically actually doesn't have a lot of influence on voting because, unfortunately, again, a lot of those folks don't vote. And when you age into voting in the Black community, you age into voting through Democratic Party channels, through my kids are going to school, what's wrong with the schools? Who's helping the schools get money? The Democrats, right? So I would say that, again, the cultural impact of these Black manosphere conversations is deeply frightening to the political establishment, but in a way that doesn't reflect political shifts on the ground in aggregate.
I think that's an extraordinarily important point on a number of different elements. I want to turn to kind of a narrow question here before we let you go. But you referenced it a little bit earlier in terms of how she's approaching the issue of the criminal legal system. And, I just pulled up her, program for Black men. There's just a few things that strike me about law enforcement. I mean, one, saying that she says she wants to actually provide more money for the police to hire more cops, from the communities they serve. But look, you're in Baltimore. I lived in Baltimore. I lived in D.C. It's like a lot of the cops are already Black, and here we are. But then the other thing that really caught me is it said invest in proven community violence intervention programs. But then when you read the actual fine print, it talks about community-based organizations working with law enforcement to reduce violence and crime. But a lot of the best violence interruption programs actually explicitly don't work with law enforcement to be able to build trust with those in the community. And it just seems like so much of this approach is so rooted in maintaining the legitimacy of like the institution of the police at all cost, but just putting a little black gloss on it. I mean, it seems completely ridiculous in that it couldn't really speak to anyone who's on the, the bad end of the baton.
Yes. It is a deeply captured, almost perverse relationship where the suffering of our people, the street violence we've been dealing with for decades, is a cudgel used to force us into the co-option of that industry. So some of the folks doing that work are folks from Nation of Islam, folks who are formerly street affiliated, aka gang affiliated, who are adamant about not having that tied to police. But not only does Kamala talk about forcing them to engage the police, up to 60% of the money from the grants given to community violence intervention programs can be siphoned off by like the administrators and the evaluators and the technical assistance providers. So that's Johns Hopkins. That's nonprofit industrial complex. And I argue that's also, unfortunately, increasingly the Democratic Party's base of suburban college-educated folks. So in her very agenda that claims to be the thing that is most giving money to what many people in community see as a critical issue of community violence, gun violence, that's also a setup for that industry to be co-opted by the nonprofit industrial complex, which is a jobs program for the new suburban college educated Democratic base. We've talked about that quite a bit here at LBS, about how this is a prime example of when you are a captured electorate. Even when they claim to adjust your needs, they're doing it in a way that has that interest convergence, as Derek Bell said, to feed their interest. We don't accept that. We build autonomously. We demand forms of local and state funding to actually keep those services community accountable. And we're going to do that in a Trump world or a Kamala world. And sadly, in a Trump world, people are going to, they can't depend on the feds anymore because the money will get cut off. And people will actually realize, oh, we have to do local control, state and local funding of these services, not beg the feds for money because the gravy train is going to crash. So it's complicated. We're going to organize no matter what. But I think that is a good example of critical issues being co-opted by the Democratic Party.
Well, as always, Lawrence Grand Prix, Director of Research at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. It's an honor to have you here. Appreciate you giving us some of your time on the freedom side.
Thank you.
Rania?
Well, Eugene, I saw an article today in the Washington Post about the Harris campaign is alarmed by the dead civilians on social media because they're worried about how it's going to impact their poll numbers. And it just reminds me, or it makes me think about how everything is just about every 4 years trying to make sure you can get as many votes as possible while saying nothing that offends anybody. And offering fake solutions. And I think people are increasingly seeing through that. So if Democrats are worried that they're losing support, whether it's among the Black community, the Arab community, the Latino community, I frankly just don't care anymore. I don't care. It's not my problem that you're losing support. It's not, my responsibility or anyone's responsibility to convince communities to vote for you when they just see through your BS. And I think that's, at the end of the day, in the most simplistic way possible, that's what's happening here. More people are seeing through their BS.
And when you refuse to do the things that the people you claim you want the support from want. 80% of self-identified Democrats say they want a ceasefire. So when you see that the party that claims to represent you has gone out of its way to do the opposite, what are you supposed to think? They're not addressing the most critical issues, and I want to turn to our next story in just a second here. The most critical issue for anyone who's really paying attention closely, which is not everyone, but first 2 years of Obama, they had White House, President, Senate, House. Didn't do a bunch of things they said they were going to do, and that time's public option labor rights. First couple years, Biden, Harris, they said they're going to do Build Back Better. They didn't do it. And in both cases, it was Democrats who sunk it. So then people, I think, are not dumb. And they're thinking, well, you say you're going to do X, Y, and Z, but every time you come in there and we give you the Senate, the House, and the presidency, you don't do X, Y, and Z. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that and a lot of reasons why it happens. But then you can't turn around and say, oh, I can't believe people aren't voting for me, when it's like, here is what they want. You refuse to do it. And then even when you have the power to do it, it's one thing to refuse to do it and say we don't have the power. But even when you have the power, and then you're shocked that they turn around. But anyway, we can pick up on that later as we get in the last couple weeks here. We want to turn to another critically important issue. That is Colombia, where there is some ongoing attempts to move out the president there, President Gustavo Petro. As always, we're very honored to be joined here on the show by Zoe Alexandra, a journalist and editor of People's Dispatch. Zoe, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you as always. I guess I think a lot of people probably just haven't heard about this at all, that there has been sort of like a coup situation in Colombia. So maybe just what is are happening here? Are there tanks on the street? Is it lawfare? What are we seeing?
Well, I think it's important to understand the context before going into the details of this. But first, I'll just say there aren't tanks on the streets. This is sort of like a slow developing coup that arguably, even before Gustavo Petro was elected, had already begun. Because essentially, to understand what's happening right now in Colombia, it's important to understand that the oligarchy has remained in power for decades. They have been propped up by the US. They have made deals between the two bipartisan, kind of like the liberals and the conservatives, something we're very familiar with in the United States. In order to maintain this grip on power, they have annihilated left forces through, force. in many different eras of Colombian history. And so when somehow their stranglehold on political affairs, on the institution of the presidency is kind of ripped away from them by the people, by voting for the government of change, by voting for Gustavo Petro, seeing a former member of a guerrilla group as president of the country, the alarm bells are already going off. They were already going off in 2018 when Gustavo Petro came in second place. But when it became clear that actually these traditional power groups actually had no viable candidate because so many of them have been discredited by being connected to drug trafficking, by, having participated in the governments of Alvaro Uribe, maybe being investigated by the special peace jurisdiction, really just by having two dirty hands, they can't actually really engage in political life and not face repercussions. And so when they realize, this person who actually is quite popular is going to win presidency, the United States panicking, they're going to lose the Israel of Latin America, which is Colombia. Already the wheels are in motion. So that we have to start from that premise, because everything that happened since then is just an attempt by the oligarchy to regain control over the executive branch of government of Colombia. And essentially what took place last week is that the Electoral Council of Colombia announced that they were going to investigate and press charges against Gustavo Petro, his campaign manager, and other kind of leaders of his campaign for allegedly violating the ceiling of campaign donations in his 2022 election campaign. They accuse trade unions of having violated kind of campaign donation laws. The whole thing is quite dodgy. Gustavo Petro, since this case was presented several months ago, I think it was in May, he had said, this is a very flawed attempt by the CNE, which is dominated by right-wing parties. It is a partisan body. It is not an elected body. It is not, it's the right-wing parties and all the other parties in Congress appoint people to make this electoral council. They are going outside of their constitutional limits to essentially present charges against the elected president of the country. So that's already a violation. And they don't have the legal authority to actually investigate and present sanctions on elected officials. So they made this announcement, and immediately Petro said, this is an attempt to remove me from office, because essentially what can happen now is that if they investigate and they somehow come up with findings that he and his campaign violated these electoral laws about spending, they can pass over the findings to the Chamber of Deputies, which could call for an impeachment vote. So that is essentially the details of what's happened, but really it's in this larger context of an oligarchy that has been frustrated and trying to find every single possible avenue to overthrow the first progressive president that Colombia has had in recent history.
It really is incredible because we've seen the script play out in other countries. And so I'm curious, is this something that looks like it could be successful? Or is there enough support for Gustavo Petro and enough power within the progressive movements to push back against this successfully?
Well, we've talked about, on this show specifically about these attempts by the right wing to kind of corner Gustavo Petro. And as we've commented, in every single moment where the oligarchy kind of tries to corner him, makes a maneuver to try to shake his power, to try to orchestrate some sort of operation, he has consistently called on the same people who got him elected, which is the popular movements, which is the trade unions, the civil associations, the associations of victims in the country who believe in the project of change, who believe in the government of change, and who have been fighting for a more humane Colombia and a more humane government for decades. And so he has called on people to mobilize. There have been numerous mobilizations throughout his presidency in defense of the reforms that his government has passed, in defense of last week there was one that was specifically in supporting the pension reform and rejecting the coup. So he has consistently called on people to take to the streets and to show that they're supporting his government. With regards to whether it can succeed, it's really about how the political forces in the Chamber of Deputies are going to play this, because it's at the end of the day, if there's enough pressure raised on the National Electoral Council, maybe they kind of shy away from taking this and advancing it further. However, they could very well hand over their findings to the Political Inquiry Committee of the Chamber of Deputies, and they could advance this further and bring it to a vote. Petro has not alienated liberal sectors. His government is a very wide coalition. He's actually, to the dismay of often popular movements, he's really brought in a lot of centrist forces in his government. He's made key concessions to them. So I think that he has foreseen this scenario in many ways. He knows that he needs the support of these centrist liberal groups in the House of Representatives and the Chamber of Deputies in order to survive something like this. So I think that he's prepared the ground both on the streets and in the legislature to try to resist this. But we know that Colombian politics are not so straightforward. And again, the oligarchy will not hesitate to use all possible options to put pressure on people in the Chamber of Deputies to push this and put pressure on people in the streets to kind of desist from doing this. But I think what we've seen over the past 2 years is that the people will go out and defend him. They will go out and defend this project. And I think that will be the key factor in determining how this plays out.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you raised this, Zoe, in terms of sort of the scene in Congress and what it means, because it feels like this is an important issue in terms of the overall transformation. I mean, I know that the talks have broken down between the government, the National Liberation Army, the ELN there, and one of the major issues is sort of exactly this, is that, I think what the ELN side is saying is that there needs to be deeper reforms in the country for them to lay down arms. Like, they want to see changes happening. But by frustrating Petro at every turn in Congress, there's like no way to really make that change. And so you keep the conflicts going. I mean, it almost feels like it's a deliberate strategy by the right wing to make sure that there's no peace in the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really difficult situation because not only has the oligarchy been in power for decades, but also they have incited, funded, and pushed for the creation of paramilitary groups to essentially do their dirty work for them. And those paramilitary groups have gotten stronger over the past decades. They've gotten more sophisticated. They've actually gained more land after the demobilization of the FARC. And so you have a very difficult situation where on one hand, you have the persistent right wing in Congress that's trying to, knock over Petro and the historic pact at every turn, while they're trying to push forward labor reforms, while they're trying to push forward the pension reforms. And in the territories, people are continuing to deal with a situation of extreme violence. There are continuing to be assassination of human rights defenders, of peasant leaders. There's continued attempts to expand territorial control by paramilitary and drug trafficking groups. This has not ceased, and Petro finds himself in a very difficult situation where he's trying to make good on his campaign promises to bring his slogan of total peace. But again, the ELN, not only are the reforms, I think they have criticisms of perhaps the extent of the reforms, but I think actually the main issue that they're seeing is that paramilitary groups are actually not being targeted enough by the army. They've argued that they've been given more space. They're the ones who are fighting against the paramilitary groups, and that they won't lay down arms if there's not a guarantee that the situation of paramilitarism will actually be dealt with. And I think that puts the Petro government in an incredibly difficult situation, because paramilitary violence and paramilitary groups is, again, something that has been strengthened, fortified, well-funded, and has a lot of vested interest by, again, these right-wing business owners, members of Congress. they're not gonna let go of that apparatus, which has served them so well to get control over land, control over resources, control over drug trafficking, and all of the benefits that they enjoy today. So again, we're seeing the contradiction of a progressive government that has control of the executive, some control in the legislature, but all the other key areas of power are still dominated by the right wing, be it of course, big businesses, but again, these rural, correlation of forces is still very much dominated by right-wing paramilitary. So it's a really difficult situation. The road to peace is a very long one, but I think that the situation of paramilitary violence is putting a lot of pressure on Petro, especially at this critical moment.
And then Zoe, lastly, I would want to ask you, well, I always do 2-prong questions. I guess it's my thing today, in addition to messing up metaphors. But there's 2 aspects of this I'd like you to comment on. And one is whether the makeup of the governments in the region will impact what happens in Colombia at all, because obviously when there's more right-wing governments, there tends to be more support for right-wing coups. And when there's more progressive governments, there tends to be a more fighting chance for the progressive movements. So that's one. And then the other aspect of this, not to make the United States the center of everything, but we do have an upcoming election. I haven't actually heard them talk so much about Latin America and the upcoming election. Maybe I missed it, other than, just to demonize like Haitian immigrants. But all that's to say, does it matter which one of these candidates wins with regard to a situation like what we're seeing in Colombia?
Yeah, I think the regional situation is always a critical element. With the strengthening of these more progressive platforms, Grupo de Puebla, CELAC, spaces that Colombia does participate in, as it doesn't participate in the more left spaces like Alba TCP. There has been a lot of regional support behind Petro. Of course, Claudia Sheinbaum having a good relationship with Petro has also been really important, as she was just sworn in. There have been, immediately as soon as he kind of raises the alarm, there had been messages of support all across the region. People also see that, for example, when the right wing is actually able to succeed with such efforts, it gains steam, it gains power, and it is able to actually be carried out against other governments in the region. And Petro, when he's denouncing what's happened, he makes reference to what happened in Brazil with Dilma Rousseff. He makes reference to what happened in Peru with Pedro Castillo. And he knows that it's, again, a similar recipe, different context, different specific arguments, but essentially the same thing. And so he's learned those lessons. Regional leaders have learned those lessons, and they know that if they let this happen to Petro, it can happen to them. And so I think that the regional response of condemnation has also been very important. Petro, again, has really toed the line in terms of his relations with more centrist governments. He's been able to maintain relations with, of course, not, Javier Milei is not a friend of anyone in the region. I don't think he actually wants to be associated with Latin America. But again, these centrist leaders, he has maintained this relationship with, and I think they would also be not in favor of him kind of going out in this way. And so I think that maintaining those ties, having them on alert has also been very important. There have been criticisms because this is another time that Petro has once again raised the possibility of a coup. It's happened several times. I think within Colombia, there have been criticisms of the man who cried coup. But I think that reading it correctly, there are multiple attempts to kind of overthrow him. And with regards to the United States, again, there has been, with Joe Biden, we saw this sort of readjustment in how they're going to relate to Latin America that has more progressive leaders, a Latin America that, while they all not might, defend Venezuela, they will defend themselves against U.S. intervention. And I think that with Petro's position, which was a balanced position on Venezuela. It didn't go as far as, some people would have liked. But they definitely see that he is not someone who's going to roll over for U.S. interests. And I think we can see a little bit of how they might approach a Petro government that continues to threaten their interests with what happened in Honduras, with what happened in Mexico, where we saw the ambassadors sort of giving these public declarations and condemning the governments of the countries that they were stationed in. I think always Donald Trump is going to have a more belligerent attitude towards Latin America. It's a much more kind of brutish attitude, which we saw with Venezuela immediately slapping on these heavy oil sanction sectors, with Cuba, putting them on the state sponsor of terrorism list. I think Kamala, if anything, will just continue as how it's gone. Petro has not gone so far as to challenge the fact that there are several U.S. military bases in the country. I think if he were to take that step to further challenge U.S. interests is where he might actually awaken kind of the not a sleeping tiger at all, but really the wrath of U.S. imperialism. And so far, he hasn't really crossed the line as far as they're concerned. So as long as he's kind of maintaining that middle ground, that fine line, then they're okay with it. So as of now, I think they might kind of just leave as is.
Well, a lot of different threads here, a lot to follow. Thankfully, for all of us, we have People's Dispatch, which is constantly covering Colombia and basically every other country on Earth. So if you're not following People's Dispatch, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what you've been doing. Zoe Alexandra, you are the editor of People's Dispatch. As always, we really appreciate you joining us here on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Rania?
Well, Eugene, it's always a pleasure to have on the best guests ever, every show.
Yep.
And I think we've accomplished that on this episode as well.
We have. We have. I just want to note, Mr. Sinwar, who the Israelis are reporting that has been killed, that they have killed him in Gaza. There is no comment or confirmation from Hamas. That was our big story at the top, and that is where we are now. But Rania, I want to just note for you that according to Al Jazeera, Mr. Biden and Mr. Netanyahu have talked, and they agree that it's time to make a big deal for a push to return the hostages back or whatever it may be. And the United States saying they'll redouble their push for a ceasefire, but no real plan. So, I mean, it's obviously kind of the same thing we've been hearing for a long time. But
after
nonetheless,
a year of this, I won't believe it till it happens. After a year of this, I won't believe it till it happens. The Netanyahu is a pathological liar. The U.S. officials are also pathological liars. And every time they talk about a ceasefire, it seems to be to buy more time for more genocide. So.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, the fact of the matter is it's also the semantics of the words. I mean, the whole context of the ceasefire is that there already was a deal and the Israelis rejected it because they wanted to maintain, several different elements, their forces on the Rafah border, this little corridor they've created across the Gaza Strip. They want to reduce the land. So, I mean, what they probably mean is they're willing to try to make a deal if there's a total surrender by all Palestinians, which they have not been able to do.
Who are they going to make a deal with? They were supposed to be negotiating with Yahya Sinwar. First, they were supposed to be negotiating with Ismail Haniyeh, and they killed him in Tehran. He was the head of the negotiations team for a ceasefire. And then Yahya Sinwar takes over Hamas, and now they've killed him. So I don't even know who they're supposed to be. Who are they supposed to be talking to now? It doesn't even...
It doesn't really make sense. And they already had agreement on the deal under actually both leaders. I mean, obviously Blinken tried to say at the end that Sinwar was adding different things, but I mean, it's pretty clear because the Israeli officials themselves were saying it, that they had it all set up, and then Netanyahu came in with new points. But the reason I think that it's relevant is I think that it does show that I think the U.S. and Israel feel that they're going to be able to make a push to get a total surrender from Palestinians, which has never happened in the history of Palestinians. So I don't know what they're thinking is going to happen, but it does speak to their state of mind, I think, at this point in time.
When they're saying that Palestinians, if they lay down their arms, this will be over. The last times that Palestinians have laid down their arms, the Israelis have massacred defenseless Palestinians. Literally. That's actually what historically has happened. So I wouldn't be surprised if Palestinians, as they have been, like, why all this loss and devastation for what? To just lay down your arms because another leader was killed? We'll see, but I just don't see that happening. I also don't believe Netanyahu because Yair Lapid today put out a statement congratulating the Israeli army on killing Yahya Sinwar and talked about fighting in Gaza for the next several years. The Israelis see this as a long-term, they see their future as constant fighting and constant war. So if that's how they're looking at the situation at the region, we know they have an expansionist agenda. We know they want to resettle Gaza. We know they want to take South Lebanon. They want to go to war with Iran. That all doesn't just go away because they killed another leader. I think they're definitely put in a tough spot because now the Americans can say to them and the Europeans can say to them, look, you got the guy who was the mastermind behind October 7th. Wrap it up. But we know Netanyahu doesn't want to wrap it up. So again, we'll see. I could be completely wrong. But if what we've seen over the last year is any indication, I just don't see these words meaning anything as of yet.
At least 28 Palestinians, including children, were also killed today in an Israeli strike on a school that was operating as a shelter in the Gaza Strip in the Jabalia refugee camp area. And I've seen another report of another 10 people killed in another camp where there was a strike on. So also just wanted to note that before we closed out. Also important news coming out of Gaza, the just ongoing terrible genocide and destruction. But I think that'll more or less bring us to the end of our show here today. Rania, as always, we'll continue to be with you. If you are following us in any way, make sure you subscribe here on YouTube, hit the bell, sign up for our email list, do whatever you have to do. We got a lot of great content coming out, including dispatches with Rania Khalek, and there's even some good merch you can get. Rania, anything else you want to say before we leave it there?
Yes. First of all, for those who like watching dispatches, I will be doing a live stream tomorrow with military analyst Elijah Magnier at noon Eastern time. I believe that's 9 a.m. Pacific time. And if you are in Lebanon or Palestine, it's 7 p.m. Palestine time. So tune into that. It'll be a live stream tomorrow on this channel. Make sure that you've hit that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm. And also, you can help support our journalism here at Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. You can become a member for as little as $5 a month, access exclusive merch, exclusive content, and most importantly, help sustain independent media that's more important than ever as we face off against the massive war machine.
Yes, absolutely. And on that note, just really quickly, want to also offer our solidarity to Asa Winstanley, who's been on our show a number of times, journalist at the Electronic Intifada, who is being targeted by the British government under, just bogus charges around terrorism, obviously chilling of free speech. But everyone go check out the Electronic Intifada. They've got some pieces up about what's going on with Asa, and, always great to support EI however you can. So just wanted to say that. But for myself, for Rania, for our entire Breakthrough News team, thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks to everyone who watched, and we will see you next time.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.